In World War I, soldiers expected to die from bullets, artillery, or poison gas. But the trenches held a different enemy, one so small it could hide in a stitch of fabric, one so ordinary it was almost invisible. It wasn't gunfire that crippled entire regiments. It was lice. Tiny crawling parasites that fed on the bodies of exhausted soldiers. And with each bite, they carried a disease that spread faster than orders on the battlefield. A disease capable of knocking a man out of combat, stealing his strength, blinding his vision, and leaving him helpless in the mud. By the end of the war, over 1 million soldiers had been infected. An entire pandemic unfolding beneath the helmets and greatcoats of men who thought the worst danger came from across no man's land. The condition was given a name that fit the horror of its birthplace: trench fever. But despite its simple name, this was no ordinary fever. It was a bacterial infection caused by Bartonella quintana, a microscopic organism perfectly adapted to the filth and chaos of trench warfare. It did not come from fleas or mosquitoes or rats. It spread through just one carrier: body lice. Not head lice, not the kind found in hair, but lice that lived inside the seams of uniforms, buried in the fabric soldiers could not remove for weeks. The trenches gave these insects everything they needed: damp cloth, sweat-soaked wool, freezing mud, rotting food, unwashed bodies, endless human hosts. In this environment, lice multiplied by the thousands, and with them, Bartonella quintana moved silently from man to man, platoon to platoon, trench to trench, until the disease became as common as the sound of distant artillery. Trench fever was not dramatic like a battlefield injury. It didn't leave shattered limbs or torn flesh. Instead, it attacked slowly, quietly, with symptoms that seemed harmless at first, until they overwhelmed a soldier completely. But the strangest and most feared effect came from deep inside the skull, a sudden, violent pain behind the eyes that, for many, led to temporary blindness. One moment, a soldier was aiming his rifle. The next, his world dissolved into white light and darkness. This wasn't a soldier's wound. This wasn't the enemy's weapon. This was the trenches themselves fighting back. And every man knew, once trench fever struck, he was out of the war, not because he was dead, but because he could no longer stand, march, or see. This was the true terror of the disease. It didn't kill armies, it disabled them.
To understand why trench fever exploded across Europe, you have to step into the trenches themselves, those narrow, frozen scars carved into the earth. They were not shelters, they were not fortifications, they were wounds in the landscape, filled with the misery of thousands of men living on the edge of survival. A soldier's uniform, meant to protect him, became his prison. He wore the same set of clothes for weeks, sometimes months. Wool soaked with sweat, hardened by mud, and crawling with insects. Every fold, every seam, every stitch became a warm sanctuary for lice. And once the lice had settled in, they multiplied endlessly. The ground beneath the soldier's feet was a swamp of mud, rotting earth, spilled blood, and human waste. Rain turned the trenches into rivers of filth. Winter froze them solid. Summer transformed them into pits of stench that clung to skin and fabric. Rats as large as cats scurried over sleeping men, feeding on corpses buried just inches below the surface. Water pooled in every depression, cold and stagnant. There were days, and sometimes weeks, when soldiers could not wash, could not change clothes, could not escape the damp earth pressing against their boots. Hygiene wasn't a luxury, it was a fantasy. The stench was so overwhelming that veterans later said you could smell a trench before you saw it. And then there was the cold. A relentless, bone-deep chill that froze sweat to skin and kept uniforms perpetually damp. The perfect climate for lice, the perfect climate for disease. Add overcrowding, rows of men packed shoulder to shoulder, sleeping in shifts, sharing blankets, rifles, water bottles. One louse could easily spread to 20 men overnight. In these conditions, Bartonella quintana didn't just survive, it thrived. The moment a louse bit a soldier, the bacteria entered the bloodstream, and the countdown began. No trench was safe. No army was immune. Lice spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, silent, invisible, unstoppable. And when one man fell sick, it wasn't long before his entire unit felt the fever, the weakness, the stabbing bone pain, and the dread that blindness might be next. The trenches were not just battlefields. They were perfect biological incubators, engineered by war, fueled by misery, and weaponized by nature.
Trench fever didn't announce itself gently. It struck like an ambush, sudden, violent, and completely disorienting. A soldier could be standing in the firing line one moment, and the next, his body would erupt with a surge of fever so intense it felt like his blood was burning from the inside out. One minute he was stable. The next, he was shaking uncontrollably, vision blurring, lungs working overtime to keep up with the rising temperature. Then came the headache. Not the dull throb of exhaustion, but a sharp, electric pain that drilled behind the temples, pulsing with every heartbeat. Many described it as if someone were tightening a band of steel around their skull. But the most feared symptom, the one every soldier whispered about, was the bone pain. It wasn't soreness, it wasn't aching. It was a sensation they called shin crushing, a stabbing, grinding torment that radiated through the legs with each step. Some soldiers couldn't stand. Others collapsed where they were. Many believed their bones were literally cracking from the inside out. And then, the eyes. Trench fever attacked the optical nerves with terrifying unpredictability. A soldier might suddenly feel a deep burning pressure bloom behind his eyes, followed by a flash of white, then darkness. Some lost their vision for hours, some for days. A few never recovered it at all. Temporary blindness became so common that officers had to assign men to guide the infected through the trenches, leading them by the arm through mud they could no longer see. Those who retained their sight often experienced severe blurring, violent sensitivity to light, a sense that the world was tilting or spinning, disorientation so strong they couldn't aim a rifle or read a map. And the misery didn't stop there. Rashes spread across the body like red warning signals. Joints swelled and throbbed. Dizziness struck without warning, leaving men clutching the trench walls for balance. Strength evaporated, sometimes in a single night. But perhaps the cruelest feature of trench fever was its rhythm. It didn't strike once and leave. It came in waves. A soldier would suffer for days, improve, return to duty, and then the fever would crash over him again, and again, and again. The psycho broke morale. It broke discipline. It broke the illusion that soldiers had control over anything happening around them. No one feared death from trench fever. They feared living through it, over and over, with no guarantee their vision, strength, or sanity would return each time.
Among all the symptoms of trench fever, none inspired more fear than the sudden assault on a soldier's vision. Pain in the legs could be endured, fever could be fought, exhaustion could be masked with willpower. But blindness, that was different. When a soldier felt the first pulse of pressure behind his eyes, he knew the disease had crossed a line. The cause was brutally simple. The bacteria didn't stay in the bloodstream. It invaded the tissues surrounding the eye, triggering inflammation of the optic nerve, the nerve that acts as the cable between the eye and the brain. Once this nerve swelled, signals struggled to pass through. Vision dimmed, sharpened, flickered, then vanished altogether. At the same time, the heat raging inside the body raised internal temperatures to dangerous levels. Heat thickened the blood. Circulation slowed. The tiny vessels that fed the retina, the light-sensitive layer of the eye, became congested, starved of oxygen. Some soldiers described it as a curtain slowly falling over their sight. Others said it was like staring into a lantern until the world dissolved into white. Many saw halos, sparks, or shadows crawling across their vision before everything went dark. In severe cases, swollen tissue exerted physical pressure on the retina, distorting vision or shutting it down completely. The body wasn't just sick, it was actively sabotaging the soldier's ability to perceive the world. And in the chaos of trench warfare, a blind soldier was as vulnerable as a wounded one. He couldn't fire his rifle, couldn't read orders, couldn't navigate the maze of mud walls, ladders, and debris. Even walking became a dangerous act. One misstep, and he could fall into shell holes, barbed wire, or enemy fire. The remedy was brutal but necessary: immediate evacuation. The moment blindness struck, medics pulled the soldier out of the line. He became a casualty, not of bullets or gas, but of a microscopic organism carried by lice. Some regained their vision after days of rest. Some never did. But all of them left the battlefield changed, because nothing rewrote a soldier's understanding of war faster than the realization that, in the end, it wasn't the enemy's weapon that took his sight. It was the trench itself.
In the grand strategy rooms of World War I, generals obsessed over artillery range, troop numbers, fuel reserves, and supply lines. But none predicted that an army could be slowed, weakened, even paralyzed by something as insignificant as a louse. Yet that is exactly what happened. By the midpoint of the war, over 1 million soldiers had been infected with trench fever. Not wounded, not killed, just removed. Swept off the battlefield by a fever that refused to end quickly, and a pain that returned in merciless cycles. When a soldier fell sick, he was gone from the front for weeks, not days, weeks. And when he returned, the disease often struck again, dragging him back to the medical tents, back to the cots, back to the long recovery that seemed almost designed to break morale. Imagine a battalion preparing for an assault. Rifles cleaned, bayonets fixed, spirits sharpened by the promise of momentum. But when the roll call begins, dozens are missing. Not because the enemy fired first, but because the trench itself has already claimed them. Entire companies were forced to delay operations. Offensives stalled before they began. Reinforcements arrived exhausted, short-handed, or half-blind. Medical wards overflowed with men shaking from fever and writhing in leg pains so severe they couldn't walk unaided. Commanders wrote furious letters to high command asking for replacements, but the replacements were often sick as well. Trench fever didn't simply attack individuals. It attacked the machinery of war. One infected soldier meant another man pulled to replace him, another medic assigned to monitor him, another stretcher bearer removed from combat, another officer adjusting plans, another gap in the firing line, another delay in the schedule. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and the disease becomes a strategic disaster. It didn't kill armies, it dismantled them from the inside, slowly, predictably, and relentlessly. As one British soldier wrote in his diary, "We have three enemies in the trenches: the shells, the mud, and the lice. Only one of them never misses." Trench fever proved a brutal truth of war. You don't need to kill soldiers to defeat an army. You only need to disable them faster than they can be replaced.
Trench fever carried a strange, almost ironic cruelty. It rarely killed. It did not leave bodies on the battlefield or fill the casualty lists with fatal wounds. And that was exactly why military leaders underestimated it at first. But in war, a disease doesn't need to kill to become catastrophic. It only needs to remove a soldier from the fight. A bullet ends life. Trench fever removed weeks from the war effort. Weeks of lost manpower, lost momentum, lost planning, lost confidence. A soldier stricken with the fever couldn't march, couldn't lift equipment, couldn't hold a rifle steady. Many couldn't see. Others couldn't stand without assistance. Even when the fever subsided, the crushing bone pain, dizziness, and relapsing symptoms made any return to duty unreliable. And while a fatal wound takes one man out of the line, a disabling disease affects far more. The medics who treat him, the stretcher bearers who evacuate him, the replacements pulled from reserves, the officers forced to redraw their plans, the comrades who must fight with thinner ranks. In effect, one case of trench fever disrupted dozens of soldiers at once. That's why military doctors later classified it as a debilitating disease, a term for conditions that break an army, not by killing its men, but by draining their strength until the army can no longer function. In the brutal mathematics of war, a disease that disables thousands can be far more destructive than a weapon that kills a handful. By the height of the conflict, generals realized something chilling. Artillery shells destroyed trenches, but trench fever destroyed armies. It didn't take lives, it took time. And in war, time is the most precious resource of all. When trench fever first erupted across the Western Front, military doctors were baffled. The symptoms were intense, the relapses unpredictable, and the number of infected men rising at an alarming rate. Yet nothing about the disease fit neatly into the medical knowledge of the time. At first, the theories were almost guesswork. Some believed it was a form of influenza, triggered by the cold, damp air of the trenches. Others suspected contaminated water, blaming stagnant pools and mud. A few thought the cause was trench toxins, mysterious vapors rising from decomposing bodies buried too close to the surface. And in the chaos and superstition of war, even the soldiers invented explanations. They called it trench poison, the mud sickness, or the enemy's curse. But none of those theories matched the evidence. The disease didn't spread through coughing like influenza. It didn't strike everyone drinking the same water. And it didn't respond to known treatments for infection. So doctors began to investigate more aggressively. They collected blood samples, urine samples, even tissue biopsies, anything that might reveal a hidden pathogen. They studied fever cycles, pain patterns, and recovery times. They compared soldiers from different units, different battalions, even different national armies. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Every soldier diagnosed with trench fever was infested with body lice. Not hair lice, not fleas, body lice specifically, the kind that live inside the seams of clothing. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a trail. So researchers began a series of bold, risky experiments. In controlled conditions behind the lines, volunteers allowed themselves to be bitten by lice taken from infected soldiers. It was a horrifying idea, but war had created its own rules. Sometimes the only way to defeat an invisible enemy is to face it directly. Within days, the volunteers developed the same sudden fever, crushing leg pain, bursts of headache, eye pressure, and the telltale relapse cycle. The breakthrough was undeniable. The lice were the carriers. So now the next question emerged. What exactly were they carrying? It wasn't until after the war, when laboratories were calmer, resources richer, and technology more advanced, that scientists finally isolated the bacteria. In the early 1920s, researchers extracted a tiny organism from the guts of body lice, Bartonella quintana, a small, fragile-looking bacterium that had crippled entire divisions of soldiers. This discovery rewrote the medical understanding of wartime disease. For the first time, military medicine realized that not all battlefield enemies carried guns. Some hid in uniforms. Some crawled across skin. Some infiltrated blood. And some, like Bartonella quintana, could halt an army without ever being seen.
Once doctors discovered that lice were the true enemy behind trench fever, armies across Europe launched a massive campaign to stop an insect from doing what artillery could not. But the fight was messy. In the trenches, delousing became a ritual that bordered on comedy, if the consequences weren't so devastating. Soldiers began by burning their uniforms over open flames, holding jackets, socks, and underwear dangerously close to fire in hopes of killing the lice buried in the seams. Sometimes it worked. Other times, the uniform caught fire entirely, leaving the soldier half naked in a trench filled with frozen mud. When flames weren't an option, men resorted to pressing their clothes with hot metal, heating bayonets or rifle barrels and sliding them across collars and cuffs. They could hear the lice pop, tiny crackling sounds like frying fat. It was considered a victory. Then came the relentless inspections. Every morning, soldiers would roll up their sleeves, pull back their collars, and check the stitching for dark clusters of eggs. If they found them, and they usually did, out came the knives, the fire, or the harsh chemicals. Armies issued delousing powders so strong they burned the skin. Men rubbed them into their armpits, necks, and waists, coughing as clouds of toxic dust rose around them. Some suffered rashes, chemical burns, or breathing problems, yet the lice survived. Hair, too, became a casualty. Units began implementing mandatory shaving, stripping men of beards, mustaches, and sometimes even the hair on their heads in an effort to remove possible hiding places. Soldiers joked that the lice knew exactly which regulations had changed, because the moment one hiding spot was removed, they crawled somewhere else. Behind the lines, armies created delousing stations.
tents or wooden huts where exhausted men waited for their turn to have their uniforms boiled, steamed, or chemically treated. The process could take hours, and by the time the soldier returned to the front, the lice had often returned as well. Because the truth was harsh. You cannot stay clean in a trench. You cannot dry your clothes. You cannot isolate yourself from others. You cannot stop lice from crawling across shared blankets, shared coats, shared trenches. Even after all the burning, scrubbing, shaving, steaming, and chemical warfare, the parasite always found a way back. One British captain famously wrote, "We fight the Germans by day and their lice by night. Only one of them refuses to retreat." The soldiers laughed when they read it, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Despite all their efforts, trench fever continued to spread. Because in the trenches, the enemy didn't need bullets. It only needed a warm body and a dirty uniform.
In the trenches of World War I, the word treatment felt almost misleading. There were no antibiotics, no targeted therapies, no miracle injections waiting in a medic's kit. When trench fever struck, doctors couldn't cure it. They could only wait it out. A soldier carried to the medical tent received the same routine over and over. Rest. Hours of lying still under soaked blankets, shivering as the fever rose and fell in violent cycles. Pain relief. Crude medications that dulled the crushing agony in the legs and the knifing headaches, but never truly erased them. Fluids. Broth, water, anything to keep dehydration from making the symptoms worse. Isolation. Not to protect him, but to protect everyone else. They moved sick men to separate quarters, hoping the lice wouldn't follow. But lice do not respect walls or distance. They travel with fabric, with movement, with the smallest mistake. A soldier could spend weeks recovering, only to return to duty and collapse again days later. Medical officers grew so accustomed to the cycle that they kept lists. Men who were sick, men who would be sick again soon, and men who had already survived 3 or 4 rounds of the fever. But time moved on. Medicine advanced. Today, trench fever is no longer a military nightmare. Doctors can diagnose it within hours and treat it effectively using antibiotics like doxycycline or rifampicin. A disease that once crippled entire divisions can now be stopped with a simple prescription, if the patient can reach a clinic, if they can afford treatment, if they live somewhere with medical access. And that's the tragedy. Because trench fever never disappeared. It simply moved. It now hides in the shadows of modern cities, in places where conditions eerily resemble the trenches. Among the homeless, who sleep in the same clothes for weeks, among refugees cramped and overcrowded shelters, among the poor who lack access to showers or clean laundry, among inmates where lice spread rapidly in confined spaces. Doctors have even given it a new name, urban trench fever, a reminder that the disease was never about war. It was about humanity's oldest companions, poverty, overcrowding, and the insects that thrive in both. And as long as those conditions exist, the fever will continue to find new hosts.
For many people, trench fever feels like a relic of World War I, a sickness trapped in the black and white photographs of soldiers buried in mud. But diseases don't respect history. They come back whenever the world recreates the conditions that once fed them. And today, we have recreated those conditions almost perfectly. Because the real engine behind trench fever was never the trenches themselves. It was poverty, crowding, dirt, and the tiny insect that thrives where human suffering is concentrated. Modern cities, despite their skyscrapers and neon lights, still contain pockets that look disturbingly similar to 1916 Europe. People living on the streets wrap themselves in the same clothes for days or weeks. Without showers, without clean laundry, without access to basic hygiene, their bodies become a perfect refuge for lice. The same lice that carried Bartonella quintana across battlefields a century ago. In overcrowded refugee camps, families sleep shoulder to shoulder, sharing blankets, jackets, and the insects hidden inside them. Aid workers sometimes report entire shelters where lice move freely from person to person, just as they once moved from soldier to soldier in the trenches. Prisons, too, can create the same cycle. Tight quarters, limited hygiene, rapid movement of inmates, the bacteria needs nothing more. Even low-income neighborhoods in developed countries can become hotspots when laundry facilities are scarce and housing is cramped. Disease doesn't ask where you live, it only asks whether lice can survive there. And so, trench fever returns, not as a military epidemic, but as a social one. Doctors now call it urban trench fever, a name that says everything, because the virus never evolved, the bacteria never changed, we did. We rebuilt the same environments of desperation that once defined the trenches. And as long as these conditions exist, trench fever will remain exactly where it has always been, hidden in the seams of clothes, waiting for the next human host.
Before World War I, commanders believed wars were decided by bullets, artillery, and the courage of men charging across fields. But trench fever shattered that illusion. It proved, violently, that an army can collapse not from enemy fire, but from an organism smaller than a grain of rice. The disease spread so widely, so unpredictably, that generals began to realize something terrifying. You can prepare for the enemy's guns. You cannot prepare for a plague inside your own ranks. Entire battalions suddenly lost their fighting strength, not from wounds, not from retreat, but from men who simply could no longer stand, see, or march. This changed everything. For the first time in modern history, military leaders were forced to treat hygiene as a weapon, not a luxury, not an afterthought, a weapon as critical as rifles and artillery. The British Army established the first large-scale delousing stations, entire units whose only mission was to fight lice. Commanders ordered mandatory uniform burnings, disinfecting lines, and rest camps far behind the front, not for morale, but for survival. Medical officers began documenting symptoms with surgical precision, marking the birth of modern epidemiology in warfare. They learned that a single infected soldier could disable an entire company, that filth could cripple an army faster than enemy shells, that disease was not a side effect of war, it was one of its most aggressive combatants. Trench fever forced armies to evolve. It pushed them to develop new sanitation protocols, to redesign uniforms, to rethink trench layouts, to study insects as carefully as they studied enemy tactics. It taught them that victory isn't only decided by who fires first, but by who keeps their soldiers healthy enough to fight at all. And long after the guns fell silent, its lesson remained carved into military doctrine. In war, the smallest enemy is often the most devastating. They called him Private Ellis, 22 years old, strong, fast, The kind of soldier who always volunteered to run messages through the mud when others hesitated. One morning, after a night of shelling, Ellis stood up to join his unit's rotation. But something was wrong. The trench around him looked blurry, the outlines of helmets fading into fog. Within minutes, the world dissolved into shadows. He wasn't hit. There was no blood, no explosion, no warning, just darkness. Medics carried him out, terrified he'd been exposed to gas. But the diagnosis was something far stranger. Trench fever had inflamed his optic nerve, stealing his sight as silently as it had stolen the strength of thousands before him. For 3 days, Ellis lived in total blackness, hearing only the distant guns and the breath of men who feared they were next. Then, as suddenly as it came, his vision returned. Not perfect, but enough to see shapes, movement, life. He survived, but he never went back to the front. His entire company, once 140 men strong, would be pulled from the line weeks later, not because of enemy fire, but because more than half of them were crippled by the same invisible enemy. And that was the true horror of trench fever, a disease that didn't need to kill to win. It only needed to break enough soldiers, blind enough eyes, and weaken enough legs, until the war itself slowed to a crawl. Sometimes, the deadliest weapon in a battlefield isn't forged from steel, but carried on the back of a louse.